Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 1 game from the Marshall Premier Fide Open that takes place once a month at the Marshall Chess Club. Now, this is a 5-round event, so there's no norm chances or anything like that, but it's actually one of the few FIDE-rated events that actually happens in New York on a regular basis, and so it's a good opportunity just to pick up some points if you play decently. And yeah, typically there are 1 or 2 Grandmasters that tend to play as well. Now, if I give a little bit of a story time, or at least recap, I'd actually just gotten back from Denmark. So I was actually abroad in Denmark and Germany before this. The last tournament before this was, of course, the Lüneburg Chess Festival, and I'd actually done quite poorly in that event, and that event finished in early August, and then I flew back to New York in the middle of August. I think it was like August 16th or August 17th, and I didn't play any chess for a few weeks, and quite frankly, I actually didn't have anything planned on the chess calendar after the summer. So everything that I was playing from this point on to the rest of the year was kind of last minute planning to a certain extent, because my game plan was to kind of reevaluate the Road to Grandmaster journey after the summer was over, and I actually was in such a bad place physically that I actually was thinking about suspending the journey. But then what wound up happening is when I got my second GM norm, I thought, well, maybe I should keep this going. Maybe I should continue, and maybe I am healthy enough to keep playing, and so on. So I decided to keep on the road, if you will, on the narrow path, and just see what happens. So that kind of was the decision I made when I got back to New York after the summer. So yeah, so this was my first tournament after the debacle in Germany, and I was hoping to recover and just kind of have a fresh start, if you will. You know, being it's a new season, we're in the fall now, and things just making some adjustments, and maybe some things would go my way. Now, my opponent in this one was an untitled player by the name of Anthony Levin. Of course, when you play in most tournaments, but especially in weekend events, as they're called, or weekenders, as I think people in England call them. When you play these weekend events, you're going to play down a few rounds. You're going to maybe get 1 or 2 games up if you're lucky, and so you have to do your job to get those opportunities. And so I was playing an untitled player, and I'd have to do my job, and then if I did my job, I'd play someone stronger down the line. But of course, every player has particular strengths and weaknesses, and you don't want to take anyone for granted. I certainly did not. So without further ado, let's get into it. I was white, and I was hoping to get off to a fast start. So anyways, I opened with d4, and Anthony played knight f6, and I went c4, and then e6, and I went for knight c3, and it's actually kind of funny because the last video I did before this one, in round 9 in the Lüneburg Chess Festival, was actually a game that was in the Nimzo as well. So actually my very last chess game before this one was my Nimzo Indian game, and I was hoping that maybe we'd repeat that line, and funnily enough, a Nimzo appeared on the board. Now, as has been my habit when facing the Nimzo, I decided to play queen c2. I've mentioned in the past why this variation I actually enjoy. I get the 2 bishops right away, and I also don't spoil my pawn structure. And bishop pair and pawn structure are 2 long-term trumps that I prize greatly. So I was very, very enthusiastic about going for this line because I just think it offers white long-term chances. So after queen c2, Black castled, which is a normal move. There's also d5 as an option, c5 as an option, and b6. But castles and even knight c6 actually is a move. But castles is one of the popular of the bunch. And then, as is the idea with the classical Nimzo, you go a3, you challenge that bishop on b4 right away. If it goes to e7, you play e4, so black is pretty much obliged to take. And after bishop takes e3, queen takes e3, we have this classical Nimzo Indian position where essentially white is the bishop pair, but black is a lead in development. So black really is trying to get something in the short term that will offset the issues that he'll likely experience in the long term. So The question is, how does black get the short-term play in effectively? There are many ways to do this. Sometimes it's to play for the e5 break. Sometimes it's to just get the knight into e4 and to play like a Dutch style. Sometimes it's to play bishop b7 and I'll actually play for c5. And pretty much those are the key things, is kind of to try to break open the center, to get some counterplay in the middle before I consolidate. Because if I consolidate, there will be problems for black. So anyway, Anthony actually decided to play knight e4, and this is actually a move I had not faced before, but it's funny because since the plans are so common, or transpositional rather, I actually got a position after knight e4 a few moves later that I actually was familiar with, and I think that kind of is just emblematic about how similar the themes are in the structure. So after knight e4, the queen is harassed, and the best square is actually to go to c2. The reason for this is that you actually keep your queen 2 diagonals away from the knight on e4, so it can't be harassed for some time. And you also still, eye the c4 pawn, and it's just the best square for the queen. So after queen c2, black now went f5, and this is actually a slight remix on a game that I'd actually played against Yaroslav Zarabuk from, what was that? The New York International. And honestly, it's actually kind of similar to the game in round 9 at the Lunenburg Chess Festival against Jari Ruker, where they're essentially going for this Dutch stonewall plan with f5 and knight e4. And the idea is to anchor the knight on e4 long enough to drum up some counterplay on the king side. So in the future, a bishop probably comes to b7. There might be some queen f6 or rook f6, rook g6 sighting. And the point is that black will try to get some initiative going on the king side. So after f5, I played knight f3, just developing. And I actually made this comment in the last video as well in this variation, that an argument could be made for going b4 right away. And the reason for that is if black actually intends to go a5, why not take the space right away with b4, so that if you can meet a5 with b5, and I don't think there's a huge difference between starting with b4 or starting with knight f3. So this is something that, I realize now, but maybe something that I maybe could have employed in that game. So I went knight f3, but b4 is a legitimate option. And after knight f3, black actually played b6, so he didn't go for a5, and this actually gave me the opportunity to go e3 first, but ultimately I intended to go b4 myself. So even here, I actually could have gone b4 before playing e3, but I didn't. So I went e3, and after bishop b7, I did go b4, and we get the structure that I kind of was looking for, where I get the bishop, the dark square bishop, on the long diagonal pointing towards the king. My other bishop on f1 typically will go to e2 or d3, and with the bishops both, basically developed nicely pointing towards the king side, white has an advantage. The bishop pair is certainly an advantage, and it also discourages black from actually opening up the center, because if you open up the center with c5 or d5 or something along those lines, my bishops will ultimately get the scope that they need to get that counterplay against the black king. So this position I felt quite comfortable with, and funnily enough, it's actually transposed exactly to my game against Yaroslav Zarabuk, because after the move b4, black actually played the move d6, and this was exactly what Yaroslav did. He put the knight on e4, he played f5, put the bishop on b7, and then went d6. So it's actually a perfect transposition. But I'm not so sure my opponent was aware of this game because, who knows? Many times when you're playing in these Marshall Premier once a month weekender events, you get the pairings literally 5 minutes before the round starts, so you don't really have any time to seriously prepare. So I do have my doubts that he was aware of this game. And anyways, after d6, I went bishop b2. This is a move that I actually employed against Yaroslav, and it's actually quite effective because now it actually discourages the c5 break because my bishop is already on this diagonal eyeing the g7 pawn. And here, surprisingly enough, my opponent actually went for c5 anyway. And actually, after the game, when we spoke about some of the moves, I actually point out c5 as a move that I actually believe to be a mistake. And the reason it's a mistake is because, like I said, you're actually giving the bishop this scope on the diagonal that it doesn't really, I don't want to say deserve, but it really shouldn't have. Because if you allow it to have it, you just kind of accelerate my counterplay in the middle. And again, black is supposed to have the short-term trumps here. So to me, a better, more prudent way of playing would be to go knight bd7 and not play c5, and maybe go like rook f6, rook g6, just to kind of at least pretend that you're trying to attack. So c5 actually has a problem with it, and I did not catch this properly when I played against Yaroslav Zarabuk. I actually played b takes c5, trying to play rook b1 and exploit the bishop on b7. But what I learned is that, through the computer, actually, the engine was pointing this out, that the exchange d takes c5 is actually more favorable. And so in this position, I actually played d takes c5. And so I actually was able to improve on a game that I played basically 2 or 3 months ago, because I'd actually seen this position before. And the reason d takes c5 is a better move is because if black plays d takes c5, all of a sudden the e5 square is very weak and backward, and the e6 pawn is a backward pawn. And of course my bishop is also wonderfully placed on this diagonal, unopposed by a black dark squared bishop. And so you really are kind of obliged to play b takes c5, which Anthony did play. But the issue here is that this is actually a positive pawn tension for white, because if black actually takes on b4, after a takes b4, I have let's say I play a nothing move like h4. After this exchange on b4, my rook gets activated, and I still have good control of some central squares, b, c5, and d5, and my bishop is on the long diagonal. So it's actually a really great position for me, a good positive pawn tension. And then the other issue with this tension is that it actually prevents black from shutting down the diagonal of my dark square bishop. So you might imagine that a move like e5 might be something that you would consider playing at some point. Well, it's really unlikely that the e5 pawn will stay there forever comfortably, because there might be a scenario where I can go b takes c5 and actually undermine the d6 pawn, which is actually trying to cover both pawns at the same time. Of course, in this position, the knight on e4 covers c5, but there could be a scenario where the knight is actually forced to move away, maybe by the move knight d2, undermining the knight security on e4, and then b takes c5 becomes a legitimate threat, undermining the d6 pawn and ultimately the whole structure in the center. The other thing is that this d6 pawn is backward and a little bit weak, and so there are scenarios where I can actually just go rook d1 and gang up on the backward d pawn. And so basically the point is that even though it appears that black has a decent pawn chain right down the center, it's actually can be undermined in several ways, and that's a problem. The other issue in this structure is that I actually have a queenside pawn majority, which is actually quite mobile. So in some circumstances, I can actually entertain playing b5 and a4, and then all of a sudden these pawns on the queenside could be, pass pawns one day, particularly when only the a7 pawn could fight against the a and b pawns if I push them to the 5th rank. So basically, there's a lot of different ways that white can play this position dynamically, and that, coupled with the two bishops, just ensures white should have an advantage. And so that's why actually d takes c5 is better than b takes c5, even though b takes c5 is playable. It's just not as correct. And this is the move that I understood now after playing that game against Yaroslav. So anyways, after d takes e5, b takes c5 was played, and I did not play the move h4, but just simply played the move bishop e2. And the point is that I'm just going to try and keep my trumps, keep this positive pawn tension, keep my bishop eyeing the diagonal, and just try to castle, and then really decide quite concretely what my plan is next. Now, there are many moves in this position that white could try. Just to show you a few of them, one is knight d2, actually undermining the knight on e4 right away. There could be a scenario with knight d7, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and queen d2. And we can see in this variation that I still have this nice structure on the queen side, and I'm keying in on the d pawn on d6, that backward pawn in the center, and white just has a nice advantage here. And at some moment I can also play f3 and kick the bishop back on this diagonal. Another line that's possible is actually bishop d3. Now, typically I'm not so keen on the bishop coming to this square. Part of the reason is because if I do take on c5, the knight can sometimes attack the bishop on d3 with tempo, and I also don't like that the bishop on d3 sometimes blocks a heavy piece from targeting the d-pawn, but it is an option. And after bishop d3, c takes b4, a takes b4, a5, this is what the computer is giving, just undermining my pawn structure a little bit. I can actually go for two moves. So one is b5, just getting that protected passed pawn I was talking about. This one is good for white, but I'm not so keen on it just because black gets this lovely c5 square for his knight and seems to blockade the pawns quite well. So I actually prefer the move knight d4 after a5, and this one attacks the e6 pawn and is actually not so easy to defend. And after knight d4, I'm also threatening f3, kicking the knight back on e4. So the computer was actually giving knight a6, threatening the b4 pawn twice and some annoying forks. And the line it was giving was actually knight e6, knight b4, knight takes d8, knight c2, bishop c2, rook fd8. And in this position, I still think white is actually better because we essentially have 5 pawns each, but I have 2 pawn islands, right? I have one solid chain here and then one pawn on c4, and black has 3 pawn islands because d6 and a5 are both isolated, and so my pawn structure is better. I also have the 2 bishops, and after the simple f3, already the pawn on f5 is actually coming into question after the knight moves, and so a position like knight c5, after knight c5, I think is just better for white. Funnily enough, bishop takes f5 is actually a slight mistake because of the move bishop c8. And remarkably here, black has a lot of counterplay based on knight d3 check if I take on c8. So bishop takes f5 is not the best move. It's better to start with king f2 after knight c5. And you can just see here that even though white has, maybe has to contend with this a pawn being a little bit of a nuisance, structurally white is better. So this is the type of position that I would be totally fine playing. But, of course, I went for the move bishop e2, and there's nothing wrong with that. So, after bishop e2, black actually played knight c6, and this move is actually another mistake on black's part. And it's kind of funny because, again, I feel like I'm a broken record going back to this game I played against Yaroslav Zarabuk in the Road to Grandmaster series. Definitely check out that game just to compare the similarities and differences. But he actually played knight c6 against me as well and challenged the pawn on b4. And actually in that game, I actually could have played the b5 move, but I thought it wasn't a great move, and I actually decided to not play b5. But I actually learned here that when the knight goes to c6 to attack b4, you actually want to play b5 and get that queenside pawn majority structure I was talking about. So unfortunately for my opponent, I actually just understood the plans a little bit better than he did. And because of that, this knight c6 move is just a mistake. Instead, knight d7 is a better move, not inviting me to play b5 with tempo and trying to just keep developing. Also, e5 is actually possible, and even though I spoke about how the center is, can be undermined in a myriad of ways, at least for the time being, my bishop is temporarily shut down on the diagonal. So this would be a better way to fight. Instead, after knight c6 and b5, the issue is that the knight can't come forward in the center because I have 2 pieces on the e5 square, and if the knight goes to a5, it's actually kind of passive. It is eyeing the c4 pawn, but besides that, it's actually doesn't have many squares, and the action really is going to take place in the central squares, so not the best decision to keep the knight on the rim like that. And so, yeah, it's already a tough spot for black to be in. After the move b4, Anthony actually played queen a5 check. And this move would seem to make sense. It's consistent with knight c6. You're provoking b5. you're creating a bit of a crisis for my king in the center because it's not castled yet. And the natural way to block, or the way you'd want to block, is just to block with a bishop. But I can't do that because it would just hang. And so I actually need to play the move knight d2 to block. And I'm actually voluntarily walking into a pin. But the problem for black is that there is no way to increase the pressure on this pin. And I can very, very quickly diffuse black's pressure with the move f3. And so essentially, if this knight moves away, let's say to e5, this actually would have been the best move. I can just go f3, challenging the knight on e4, and if you move back, well, then I castle with a great position. But if you take on d2, or actually you can start with f4, which is a nice little tactic, because if I take here, there's this pin here that's annoying. And so I would take on f4 first. But now after knight takes d2, queen takes d2, we have these exchanges. And actually, these exchanges help white because, again, white is the endgame trumps with the healthier pawn structure and the bishop pair. And there are many, many ways that white can try to press an advantage here. But one of my favorites in this variation is just the simple bishop takes e5. And after d takes e5, king c3, you could just see here that the 3 versus 2 on the queen side, as far as the pawns are concerned, right? These pawns versus black's pawns is going to be a serious issue, and these double pawns don't actually help black's cause in terms of mobilizing his own passer. So this is a position that white has a lot of chances and really, really good chances to win the game, and black is basically just trying to hold a draw. So it again just highlights just how white does have the long-term trumps, and so it's very important that you're precise in the middle game and really the opening and early middle game to try and get enough activity so that you're not saddled with one of these bad positions later on. Unfortunately for my opponent, though, after the move knight d2, he actually blundered decisively, and it's kind of a natural blunder, I suppose, because you do understand now with the move b5 that you're going to have to trade the knights and the queens and go to some type of endgame where you're seriously worse. But unfortunately for my opponent, he made a critical mistake with the move order, and it actually just ends the game on the spot. In this position, my opponent actually played queen takes d2 check. And it actually seemed like, this isn't such a big issue. But the problem is that after queen takes d2 and knight takes d2, I actually can take either knight right now because the knight on c6 is still hanging. And so actually, I just paused for a second just to make sure. But what I noticed is that after I play b takes c6, the bishop is still attacked on b7 and the knight on d2 is attacked. So I actually don't need to take the knight on d2 right away because it actually just wins me a piece if I take the other one. So I played b takes c6, and then all of a sudden here, my opponent realized what he had done and started to shake his head because after the simple bishop takes c6, I just go king takes d2, and now all of a sudden I'm just a piece up. And to add insult to injury, you can't even try and take on g2 because there's rook hg1 and I have a massive attack on the g7 pawn. So you're really just a piece down for nothing. Now you could, after b takes c6, you could try knight b3 attacking the rook on a1, but unfortunately c takes b7 hits the rook on a8 with tempo, so you can't even get a rook for two bishops position, which would also be completely losing, but you can't even try to fight on because you're just going to be a piece down no matter what. And so actually after the move b takes c6, 17 moves into the game, my opponent actually resigned because he's just a piece down. Tough game for my opponent. I definitely empathize with losing a game this quickly. I've certainly done it before. In fact, in February of this year, I think in the Southwest, it was in February. I'm not sure what month it was this year, but I did lose a game in less than 20 moves. I believe it was against, who who was it against? I think it was against Shamanov, Alexander Shamanov. That game was actually on this channel as well. And it was just a terrible, terrible blunder where I had to resign very quickly. And it always feels terrible because you didn't even get into the game. And so, you know, it just feels like, you just feel really dumb. You feel like an idiot and you're like, man, like, you know, what do the other people think about me, you know, when they see that I make mistakes like this? But it really happens to everyone. Everyone has a bad day. And unfortunately for my opponent, his bad day was today. So anyways, I did get a win. It's nice to get a quick win because you can kind of recuperate quickly. It's nice to get quick wins before the tougher games come on the slate. And so I took that win and was looking forward to the rest of the event. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you can do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.